This lecture and the next will concentrate on the topic of network effects and cascades of adoption. Cascade of adoptions are a little bit like snow avalanches. They start small, but then they, in a very quick development, they take over the whole system and they determine a radical change in the geography of the particular spot. We're going to see that cascades of adoption can be explained by network effects, and network effects, there are different types of network effects. We will start from looking at a specific case study. The case study is a classical case study of management. It's a competition between two options. The options were about video recorders, and the competition was between two formats, a format supported by Sony Corporation called the Betamax, and a standard supported by a much smaller company, the JVC Corporation of Japan, and the standard was called VHS. I will briefly sum up the history and then I will go into the analysis of what determined the victory of one standard over the other. The first video recorders were introduced a long time ago by an American company called Ampex. The Ampex was a big machine. It was used for professional, in the professional sector. Not much happened in the video recorder sector for the next 20 years, or better, lots happened, but within the labs of companies, especially Japanese companies. At the beginning of the 70s, Sony had redefined and miniaturized the video recorder technology, and they came out with some of the first video recorders for household use, consumer electronics, in other words. Sony, in 1975, Sony came out with the first successful and mass-produced model, the Betamax. 1 year later, JVC came out with a competing standard called VHS. Sony tried to a certain extent to develop a common standard in order not to fragment the market with other corporations, but for a number of reasons that are explained in the case that I mentioned at the end of this lecture, and that you can find anyway on Wikipedia and other sources. It was the discussion between Sony and other corporations working in the same sector didn't bring any agreement, so the companies went in competition along using different standards. The question of standards is important because what matters here is that the standards were incompatible. Here I show, for instance, videotapes. This was a Betamax videotape, and this was the VHS videotapes. Now, of course, it goes without saying that you cannot use one videotape in another standard. So the standards were incompatible, which means if you committed to one standard, you couldn't see material content produced in another standard. This is a key point to understand this case. What is the evolution of the story? Concentrate from 1974 onward. From 1974 there were at least 6 competing standards in the market or ready to hit the market. As I said, the commercialization beta was 1975, and 1 year later we had the commercialization of the VHS standard. Notice that at the beginning of the 80s the diffusion of video recorders in the United States and Japan and Europe was about 5–10% of maximum, meaning about 5–10% of households had already acquired a video recorder. In the next of the story we will concentrate only on 2 companies because effectively the others disappeared. Philips survived for a while, but eventually it also withdrew from the market. So we concentrate on the beta and the VHS produced by JVC company standards. Notice that about at the beginning of the 80s, there's a radical change, there's a quick change in the diffusion speed. This curve, which we're going to see better when we talk about diffusion, is called a diffusion curve. It's also called an S curve because it has the shape of an S. And what matters in an S curve is the gradient, is the slope, is how steep this is. The steeper it is, the faster the diffusion. There's a change in the slope of this curve at about the 80s. What we're going to see is what caused that change and the effect that that change had then on the diffusion of VHS. If you read the case study, what is important to notice is that analysts at the beginning of the 80s predicted that by the end of the decade diffusion would hit a threshold of about 30%. This means that they were predicting that about less than 1/3 of the market would buy a video recorder. This means that companies were gearing production toward a relatively slow diffusion. This graph gives total production. You notice that starting on the 80s, the JVC field, JVC and Sony, were both leading two different alliances that span the whole world. Companies involved in production of technology, suppliers, media production, distributors, etc., etc. So there were two alliances competing against each other. Notice how the JVC, the VHS standard, became more predominant at the beginning of the 80s, and then by the end of the 80s the competition was over. Sony withdrew the Betamax standard from the market, and this leads to the main question of this case, and the question serves to introduce the topic of network effects and cascades of adoption. The question is, what explains not only the fact that one standard became more dominant or became more diffuse with respect to the other? The real question is why one standard killed the other standard. Why at the end of the 80s competition was over? Why Sony withdrew from the market? In traditional economics, we tend to explain why one standard is more diffuse than the other, why the market split on two segments, let's say the Mac and the PC. No, in this case there was just one winner, the other disappeared. And this is the main question we want to explain. In order to understand how technology diffuses, in other words, why consumers buy a certain product or not, we need to understand how a product is actually used. In the video recorder field, there were three prevalent uses. The first two, in terms of appearance, were the time shift and homemade movie. Time shift is recording television programs and watching them at a delayed moment. Homemade movies required some complementary technologies, like, of course, video camera, and were used for to record events like during trips or weddings or christening and so on. Now, the first two applications, time shift and homemade movies, were not only applications that were developed by single users, they usually were consumed by the same users that created the relative content. Time shift was for personal use. I record my own television program and I watch them later on. Usually I will not share that tape with friends because they would do the same thing on their own. Homemade movies are also about recording events important to a particular family, and they're usually consumed within the same family. So the point I'm going to make is that these two applications do not require sharing of videotapes among social networks. Whereas at the beginning of the 80s, a new type of application emerged, and this was the renting or buying of movies. Until that moment, movies could only be consumed within cinemas, within theaters. You had to go to the cinema in order to consume a certain type of experience. At the beginning of the 80s, starting with Hollywood distribution content and other national cinematographies, a new channel was developed, and the channel was the fact that people could now rent or buy video recorded tapes about popular movies. Now, think about pricing of something that has never been in the market before. How do you price a movie for individual home consumption in order not to cannibalize the major source of income, which is cinema tickets? Now, take one moment to reflect upon this. How would you price renting of movies if that has never been done before? So there's no precedent. Take 1 minute to think about this and then come back to the presentation. Done it? Okay, what happened historically is that distributors and content producers decided to price a movie at the cost of a family of 4 going to the cinema twice. So if the ticket for one watching, let's say, is $10, the rent of a movie was about $80. This is expensive. Now, let's go back to our social network description. We said that one of the features of social networks is homophily. Homophily means that people joined in a social network, let's talk about friends, tend to share some attributes, tend to have some similar preferences about what they like, for instance, in movies. If this is true, then coupled with the fact that the initial price was very expensive, this generated a sharing movement. Sharing means that members of a social network of friends would take turn at renting popular movies and then would share the movies among each other. If this is true, and if it is also true that the standards are incompatible, this generates a pressure to adopt one standard rather than another in a certain social network. So let's say if 5 of us are friends and 2 of them are on beta, the other 3 will find a pressure to buy beta rather than VHS. The reason is sharing. And so we introduce a very important idea in order to understand the dynamics of social networks, is interdependence. Now the members of a social network become interdependent, and interdependence is explained by the fact they want to share movies. In a social network this type, deviants, by deviants I mean people that do not conform to the dominant choice within the network, tend to be isolated. In this case, they will have to bear the full cost of renting movies without the sharing opportunity. Okay, so what is important here, we have analyzed the applications of videotapes. We have seen that the applications differ in terms of the interdependence between the users of videotapes in a certain social network. We have said that homophily tends to be important in a social network of friends. In this case, homophily refers to preferences in popular movies. Coupled with the high cost of movies, this generates interdependence among the members of a social network. What are the implications of this? So we have 3 applications. The first 2 applications, time shift and recording your own movies, do not require interdependence, as we said. This implies that if I am on a certain standard, say beta, and my friends are on VHS, this doesn't matter because consumption is individual. We do not need to be on the same standard. If instead we are dealing with the third application, which is pre-recorded tapes, then we depend on each other. If we depend on each other, this generates a new type of situation. In order to analyze this new type of situation, let's look at the value chain of movie production. The value chain of movie production starts clearly with content production. In this case, let's call them the studios at Hollywood, goes through distribution, and here we're interested in distribution at the point of contact with the customer, and finally the consumers of information, in this case movies. What type of decision they have to make in order not to be on the losing side between the two standards? Basically, the decision the three sets have to make is whether to adopt beta or VHS. In the case of media producers, the decision is whether to release new movies in beta or in VHS. As it is the case nowadays with video games, new games are released for one standard from one platform, not for other platform. That was the situation as well in the case of pre-recorded videotapes back in the 80s. The decision that distributions have to make is whether to stock in beta or VHS. Now, distribution at the point of contact with customers back in the 80s meant tiny shop, they were called corner shops, that were packed up to the ceiling with movies. Space was at a premium, hence they had to stock movies that promised to be sold or rented more than others in order to regain the cost of renting, the high cost of space. Finally, consumers, they had to decide whether to buy beta or VHS. Consumers were of course influenced by the local network of friends they had. What type of dynamics does this situation generate? Let's have a look how they decided whether to adopt one standard or the other standard. So we have three parties: Hollywood, distribution, and consumers. Let's start from Hollywood. How do they decide whether to join the Sony alliance or the JVC alliance? The game here is a game of market share. You want to be on the standard that has got which is more popular, which means has got a higher market share. And how do they get the information about which standard is winning the race? If we imagine that we're at the very beginning of the competition, so this market doesn't release clear signals, we don't know which standard is ahead. In any case, how do we get the information? Well, the information that matters is how many customers are adopting one standard or the other. So in order to get information about market share, Hollywood looks at customers, but also they look at organizations that can aggregate information about customers, in this case distribution. So they look, as we said, they try to get information about market share from consumers and distribution. What about distribution? They have to decide whether to stock in beta on VHS. How do they get information in their case about market share? Now they're interested in two types of market share. Local market share, because their customers are local, but also they're interested in general market share because that may influence the way local customers may decide which standard to adopt. In order to get information, they basically look again at what? They look at information about Hollywood, whether Hollywood is adopting one standard more than the others. Of course, they looked at local customers. What is the situation of consumers instead? Well, consumers, again, they need to commit to one standard. Let's assume that very few customers have the money to buy both standards. That was very rare. So they have to commit one standard and stick to that decision. How do they get information about which standard is winning? Well, they look at availability of movies, which really means whether Hollywood is releasing more in one standard than in the other, and they look at what is available on the local market, which is the distributor. We assume in this case that their local social network, or better, their social network, has not committed to any standard yet, so they don't have a precedent that forces their decision making. What is the general situation we find? Well, we find a very interesting situation in which decisions of each party are mutually dependent on the decisions of the other two parties. Now, this in a situation of collective interdependence in decision making, what happens if one option seems to be gaining more than the other, seems to be gaining as an advantage with respect to the others? Well, what happens is a cascade of adoption. What is a cascade of adoption? Let's imagine that we start, as we said, a situation which there's no previous information. If you are a distributor, a corner shop, you have no information about what your consumers will be choosing. You're just the first day of your shop, so you decide, not knowing, to stock 50% in beta and 50% in VHS. Now let's imagine that by any reason at the end of the first week it seems that beta is getting slightly ahead than VHS. Why is this information important? Well, it is important because the next customers that come in and ask, which standard would you suggest me to buy? They may say, the market hasn't given a clear indication yet, but it seems that more customers are on beta than on VHS. If this information is transmitted to customers and then it reaches media producers, Hollywood, then Hollywood may start releasing slightly more in one standard. The standard, this signal is transmitted to the other parties, distributors and consumers, which then decide to stock more in beta, and more customers may actually buy beta machines rather than VHS machine. If this message now circulate, then it becomes stronger and stronger, and what it generates is a cascade of adoption that via an exponential diffusion has got only 2 points of equilibrium, 0 and 100%. So a dynamics of an avalanche of adoption terminates with the complete win of one party with respect to the other party. The reason why the market doesn't fragment in majority and minority niche is that when an avalanche dynamic starts in presence of interdependence, the more a standard seems to be getting ahead, the more it reinforces that advantage. This is called a positive feedback dynamics, which we're going to examine in the next lecture. So what is the conclusion of the VHS case? Under certain conditions, in certain markets, the decision of adoption of one standard with respect to another is influenced also by the interdependence among customers. The more customers choose one option, the more that message reinforces the initial advantage. In presence of interdependence, that advantage becomes self-sustaining and self-reinforcing. The more customers are on one standard, the more the other two parties release in one standard and stock in that standard. The more they stock in that standard, the more there is availability of that standard. Historically it was VHS. The more customers, the new customers now buy VHS. The more new customers buy VHS, the more they force their local social network to conform to that standard in order to share movies. The more they share movies, the more demand for VHS grows. The final result is complete victory for one standard. This dynamic is called winner takes all, and this is typical of goods where adoption depends on adoption. The more adoption there is on one standard, the more that reinforces adoption of that very standard. In the next lecture we're going to see better how network effects work, but a situation in which diffusion of one standard creates additional demand for the same standard is a situation of network effect that, as we said, generate one winner at the expense of the other. The information for the case study come from an article, a paper that I will put in Moodle. The article is called Strategic Maneuvering and Mass Market Dynamics, the Triumph of VHS over Beta. If you want further information about this type of cascades of adoption, the best book to read is 6 Degrees, The Science of a Connected Age, but also Gladwell, The Idea of the Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference, explores the same dynamic. Also the book by Schelling is the Nobel Prize for Economics, Micromotives and Macro Behavior, examines this situation.